They bulldozed his legacy, calling it an eyesore. He hit back where it hurt most, their multi-million-dollar pride. Now, hundreds of prized koi gasp in the mud to save their precious fish and reputation. This powerful HOA must bow to the quiet farmer they scorned. An apology or utter ruin. What happens when pride meets its price? The first roar of the bulldozer felt like a physical blow to Hank Rivers. He stood at the edge of his property line, the worn brim of his cowboy hat pulled low, casting his eyes in shadow. But no shadow could obscure the sight of the yellow monster tearing into the old milking barn, the one his grandfather had built with his own hands, timber by timber, sweat drop by sweat drop. Unsuitable for the landscape, the letter from the Sterling Springs Resort Homeowners Association had declared, signed by a Martha Collins. President, unsuitable. 70 years of Rivers' blood and toil, deemed an eyesore by newcomers who wouldn't know a hawk from a handsaw. Hank didn't shout. He wasn't a shouting man. His anger was a cold, hard knot in his gut, a familiar companion these past few weeks since the final notice had arrived. He'd fought it, of course, attended their sterile meetings in the resort's clubhouse, a place so reeking of new money and false gentility it made his skin crawl. He'd spoken of heritage, of rights, of the simple decency of leaving a man to his own land. They'd listened with polite, empty smiles, then voted. Martha Collins, with her perfectly coiffed silver hair and condescending gaze, had delivered the verdict with the detached air of someone swatting a fly. The aesthetic integrity of Sterling Springs is paramount. Mr. Rivers, your structures simply do not align with our community standards. Now those structures, the barn, the stables where his daughter had learned to ride, the smokehouse that had cured generations of hams, were splintered wood and twisted metal. Dust, thick and choking, billowed into the clear mountain air, a profane cloud against the pristine blue. He watched until the last wall of the main barn buckled and collapsed. A groan of dying wood that echoed the hollowness inside him. The HOA's contracted demolition crew, faces impassive, moved with brutal efficiency. By noon, it was mostly over, a gaping wound on the land where his history had stood. Martha Collins herself made an appearance late in the afternoon, emerging from a gleaming SUV that looked as out of place on the dirt track leading to Hank's remaining farmhouse as a diamond in a pig trough. She didn't approach Hank, just stood with her arms crossed, surveying the cleared site from a distance, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. It was that smile, more than the destruction itself, that lit the fuse in Hank's soul, the casual, dismissive arrogance of it. She probably thought he was just some dumb hick, easily swept aside. He turned away, the image of her smirk burning in his mind, and walked towards the old pump house. It was set back near the creek that bordered his property. The same creek that, further downstream, fed into the elaborate series of filtration systems and, ultimately, the crown jewel of Sterling Springs, their massive, artfully landscaped koi pond. The pond was Martha Collins' particular pride, stocked with fish worth more than Hank's entire yearly income. He knew because the HOA newsletters slipped erroneously into his mailbox sometimes, boasted about them incessantly. Prized Japanese koi, living jewels, a testament to nature's beauty, enhanced by Sterling Springs. The pump house was his, on his land. The water rights, ancient and clearly deeded, were his for years. He'd allowed the overflow from his irrigation systems and the creek's natural progression to feed their voracious aesthetic appetite, an unspoken courtesy, a neighborly gesture. But neighbors didn't bulldoze your legacy and then smirk about it. Inside the cool, damp air of the pump house, the rhythmic thrum of the old machinery was a comforting sound. He laid his hand on the main valve, a large, cast-iron wheel. It hadn't been fully closed in decades. His grandfather had installed it. A fail-safe, a point of control. Generations of Rivers men had understood its significance. Closing it wouldn't stop the creek entirely, but it would divert the primary flow away from the intake that fed the resort's pond. It would significantly, drastically, reduce the water heading their way. He thought of the barn. He thought of his grandfather's calloused hands. He thought of Martha Collins's smile. The knot in his gut tightened. No longer cold, but burning. With a grunt, born of 60 years of labor and a sudden, crystalline resolve, Hank Rivers began to turn the wheel. The old valve groaned in protest, stiff from years of disuse, but Hank's resolve was a hardened sinew. He put his back into it, the muscles cording in his arms, until with a final, reluctant screech of metal against metal, the wheel refused to turn further. Done. The primary flow that had generously fed the Sterling Springs ornamental lake was now significantly choked. The creek still flowed. Of course, he wasn't a monster trying to kill it, but its main volume was now redirected, as it had been in his grandfather's orchard, to irrigate his own parched east pasture, a section he'd let lie fallow due to the increasing water demands of the resort downstream. He didn't linger. He walked back to his modest farmhouse. The silence of the demolished barn site a heavy blanket on the land. There was no triumph in his heart, only a grim sense of inevitability, of a line crossed that could not be uncrossed. He went about his evening chores, mending a fence line, checking on his small herd of cattle. The sun dipped below the peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful, indifferent backdrop to the turmoil brewing down at Sterling Springs. The first sign of trouble was subtle, a slight, almost imperceptible drop in the water level of the Grand Koi Pond. Tadashi Tanaka, the resort's meticulously hired aquatic specialist, noted it in his evening log with a frown. He made a mental note to check the automated top-up sensors in the morning. Perhaps a float valve was sticking. By the next morning, the slight drop had become an undeniable concern. The elegant stone edging of the pond, usually lapped by clear water, now showed a distinct, damp band of exposure, several inches wide. Tanaka was no longer frowning. He was actively troubleshooting, his normally serene face etched with worry. He checked the filtration systems, all running perfectly. He checked the intake pipes from the main feeder creek. A significantly reduced flow. Strange. There had been no drought declared, no upstream municipal works he was aware of. Martha Collins, during her customary mid-morning stroll to admire her koi, as she privately thought of them, was the first of the residents to voice alarm, her tone sharp as shattered glass. "Tanaka-san, what is the meaning of this? The water level is noticeably lower. Some of my prize showa are schooling very near the surface. They seem agitated." "I am investigating, Ms. Collins," Tanaka said, bowing slightly, though his eyes darted nervously towards the rapidly expanding muddy edges. "The inflow appears to be compromised. Compromised unacceptable. Those fish are worth a king's ransom. Fix it. Immediately." She tapped an expensive, patent leather-clad foot, her gaze sweeping across the pond, already envisioning the complaints from the other HOA members. The potential tarnish on Sterling Springs' pristine image. Throughout the day, the situation worsened exponentially. The several inches became a foot, then 2. The artfully placed underwater lights began to poke awkwardly above the surface. The once graceful, multi-million-dollar koi, now confined to an ever-shrinking central pool, began to thrash, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the rapidly spreading, muddy borders. Panic began to ripple through the resort staff. Maintenance crews were dispatched to the creek, searching for a blockage, a collapsed bank, anything. They found nothing but a bafflingly diminished stream feeding into the resort's intake. Hank, from his vantage point on the rise of his land, could see the distant, frantic activity. He used his grandfather's old field glasses. He saw the resort workers, like ants, scurrying along the creek bank on their side of the property line. He saw a golf cart, driven erratically, ferry Martha Collins back and forth from the pump to what he assumed was their pump house or control center. Her posture, even from a distance, radiated fury, and then, as the hours wore on, a visible desperation. The twist came late in the afternoon. One of the resort's older maintenance supervisors, a man named Earl who'd been in the valley longer than the resort itself, remembered something. "That creek," he said to a frantic Tanaka and a furious Martha Collins. "It's always been fed from up Hank Rivers' place. Old man Rivers, his daddy, had a whole system of irrigation channels. Hank mostly let it run through to us these past years, since his own farming scaled back. But the headwaters, the main diversion, that's on his land." Martha Collins went still, her perfectly made-up face, which had been flushed with anger, slowly paled. Hank Rivers, the stubborn old goat whose unsightly barn she just had torn down, the man she'd dismissed with a wave of her hand, her mind, sharp and accustomed to connecting dots for her own benefit, raced. The timing, the audacity. "Are you telling me," she said, her voice dangerously low, "that he could be responsible for this?" Earl shrugged, uncomfortable under her piercing gaze. "Don't know if he is, ma'am, but he could be. That main valve up there. If he was to close it, well, it'd do pretty much what's happening now." The image of Hank Rivers' stoic, unreadable face at the HOA meetings, the quiet dignity that she had mistaken for simple-mindedness, flashed into her mind. Then the image of the leveled barn, a cold dread, colder than the impending loss of the fish, settled upon her. This wasn't a mechanical failure. This was an attack, a deliberate, calculated act of retaliation. "Get me the schematics for the entire water system," she hissed at Tanaka. "Everything, including how it connects upstream. And someone find out exactly where that old man's property line ends and where his water controls are." The sun was setting again, and the magnificent koi, hundreds of them, were now largely confined to the muddy, rapidly deoxygenating basin of what was once a jewel of a pond. Their gasps were almost audible. A desperate, collective sigh. Martha looked at the unfolding disaster, the ruin of her prized spectacle, and a new, terrible understanding dawned. Hank Rivers wasn't just some hick to be pushed aside. He was a man who knew his land, knew his rights, and apparently knew exactly where to squeeze to make Sterling Springs gasp for air. The schematics, when they were finally unearthed from a dusty archive in the resort's administration office, confirmed Earl's recollection and Martha Collins' deepest fears. A thick, bold line indicated the main water pipe originating squarely within the boundaries of Parcel 7 owner Henry Rivers' senior estate. A smaller, almost insignificant notation marked bypass valve, pre-resort construction. It was an old map, predating Sterling Springs itself, a relic of a time when the land was governed by simpler arrangements. Martha didn't need further proof. The insolent set of Hank Rivers' jaw as she'd had his history demolished was proof enough. The audacity of the man to strike at the very heart of Sterling Springs' prestige, at her meticulously curated showcase. Her first instinct was aggression. She'd call the sheriff, accuse him of sabotage, of vandalism. But her lawyer, hastily summoned and now nervously soaping lukewarm coffee in her opulent office as dawn broke on the second day of the crisis, advised caution. "Martha, his property, his valve. Unless you can prove malicious intent specifically to destroy your property, rather than simply diverting water on his land for his purposes, which, by the way, he likely has historic rights to do, it's a muddy legal battle. Very muddy. Like your pond." The lawyer attempted a weak smile, which Martha met with a glare that could freeze fire. The koi were in a dire state. Tanaka and his team, supplemented by frantic resort staff, were working around the clock, using aerators and even attempting to manually transfer some of the smaller, more resilient fish to temporary holding tanks. But it was a losing battle. The sheer volume of fish, many of them large and delicate, overwhelmed their emergency capacities. The once beautiful pond was now a stinking mud pit. The gasping, jewel-toned bodies of the dying koi, a grotesque parody of their former elegance. The stench was beginning to waft towards the million-dollar homes. Residents were calling, their voices ranging from concerned to furious. The Sterling Springs dream was turning into a public relations nightmare. Martha decided on a direct approach, albeit one still laced with her innate sense of superiority. She drove her gleaming SUV up Hank Rivers' rutted driveway herself, bouncing uncomfortably, the dust settling on its pristine paintwork. She found him on his porch, calmly oiling a piece of old tack, the scent of leather and lanolin a stark contrast to the miasma rising from her resort. "Mr. Rivers," she began, her voice tight, foregoing any pleasantries. "I think you know why I'm here." Hank looked up slowly, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, meeting hers. He didn't rise. "Reckon I might have an idea. Mrs. Collins, this stunt of yours," she gestured vaguely towards the valley, "is costing millions. Those fish are dying. The reputation of Sterling Springs is at stake." "My barn was worth more than money to me, ma'am," Hank said, his voice even, quiet, but with an undercurrent of steel. "It was generations. My granddaddy's sweat, my daddy's, mine. You called it unsuitable." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. "Reckon I found your pond unsuitable for my water." Martha's face flushed. "This is blackmail. You can't just cut off our water supply." "My water, Mrs. Collins, from my land. Flowing through a valve my granddaddy put in long before your resort was even a glint in some developer's eye. Seems to me I can do with it as I please." He went back to rubbing oil into the leather, a dismissive gesture that pricked her fury. "What do you want?" she snapped, the carefully constructed composure beginning to fray. "Money, is that it? Are you trying to extort us?" Hank finally set the tack shit and rose. Slowly. He was taller than she remembered from the HOA meetings, his weathered frame still carrying an undeniable strength. He walked to the edge of his porch, looking not at her, but out over his land, towards the raw, empty space where his barn had stood. "Money can't bring back what you took, Mrs. Collins. You and your association, you came in here, all flash and no substance, thinking you owned the valley, thinking you could just erase a man's life because it didn't fit your pretty picture." He turned back to her, his gaze direct and unyielding. "I want an apology, not to me, not just to me. I want a public apology from the Sterling Springs Homeowners Association, signed by you, admitting you wrongfully destroyed my family's heritage, admitting you acted with arrogance and disrespect. I want it published in the county paper, and I want a commitment, in writing, that you will consult, respectfully, with long-standing residents like myself before you ever again try to impose your so-called community standards on people whose roots here go deeper than your foundations." Martha stared at him, aghast. An apology? A public apology? Her, Martha Collins, apologizing to this farmer? The humiliation of it was unthinkable. "That's absurd, preposterous." "Is it?" Hank's voice was dangerously soft. "More preposterous than watching $100,000 worth of fish gasp their last in the mud because you couldn't be bothered to show a speck of common decency, more absurd than thinking you could just bulldoze a piece of this valley's history without consequence." A resort worker, mud-stained and exhausted, came running up the track then, skidding to a halt. "Mrs. Collins, Tanaka says we're losing them fast. The big kohaku, the one valued at $50,000. It's gone, and the others are weakening. He says if we don't get full water flow in the next few hours, the entire stock will be lost. The smell, the residents are threatening to call the health department." Martha's carefully constructed world was crumbling. The power, which she had wielded with such casual disdain, was shifting. It was no longer in the HOA bylaws or the fat bank accounts of its members. It was here, on this dusty porch, with this quiet, resolute old man. He wasn't just a relic of the past. He was a force of nature, as unyielding as the mountains that framed the valley. She looked from the desperate worker back to Hank. His face was implacable. The silence stretched, broken only by the chirping of crickets in the distant, imagined gasps of dying fish. The hidden truth, the one she'd never acknowledged, was that Hank Rivers wasn't just an obstacle. He was a cornerstone of the very community she claimed to lead, a community she had profoundly misunderstood and disrespected. The county paper, she finally choked out, the words tasting like ash. And a copy, framed for my farmhouse wall, Hank added, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, as a reminder. The sight of Martha Collins, HOA president, the self-proclaimed doyen of Sterling Springs manufactured elegance, standing on his weathered, unpretentious porch, visibly deflated and stripped of her usual hauteur, brought Hank Rivers no immediate surge of triumph. Instead, a profound weariness settled over him, the kind that comes after a long, hard-fought battle where the cost has been steep on all sides. It was the slow, inexorable turning of justice's ancient wheel, grinding exceedingly fine. The resort workers' panicked plea about the rapidly dying fish, a desperate cry echoing the real-world consequences of unchecked arrogance, still hung heavy and acrid in the late afternoon air. Martha swallowed, a difficult, audible gulp. Her carefully constructed facade of invincibility was crumbling, revealing the raw fear beneath. Pride, her constant companion, was now a bitter, choking pill. If the Homeowners Association agrees to this preposterous public statement, she began, her voice strained, a mere shadow of its usual commanding timbre, now reduced to a desperate, thready rasp. You'll open the valve. You'll do it immediately. The moment we agree. Hank's gaze remained steady, unwavering as the granite peaks that frame the valley. When I hold in my hand the apology, signed by you and properly notarized, and when I have irrefutable confirmation from the Clear Creek County Chronicle that it will be printed, unedited, on the front page of tomorrow's morning edition, then the water will flow back to your dying spectacle. Hank stated, his terms as clear and unyielding as the mountain stone. Not one single moment before. He'd lived too long, seen too much, to be fooled by a desperate woman's 11th hour promises or a last-minute attempt to renege once the immediate crisis was averted. But they won't last that long. Martha cried, a genuine note of anguish finally breaking through her composure. She gestured wildly, her manicured hand trembling, towards the unseen disaster unfolding in the valley below. Hundreds of them. They're already dead or dying. We need the water now. Can't you understand? Perhaps you should have contemplated that eventuality before you dispatched your bulldozers. Mrs. Collins, Hank said, his voice level, devoid of overt sympathy but not entirely without a quiet sorrow for the innocent creatures. The living jewels, now caught and perishing in the crossfire of human folly. You and your association placed a higher value on an artificial landscape than on a man's living legacy. Now, you are witnessing the true price of that landscape when its very lifeline is severed. The subsequent hours were a maelstrom of frantic, desperate activity down at Sterling Springs, a stark contrast to the quiet, watchful, almost meditative stillness that settled over Hank's farm. Martha, her face a grotesque mask of barely suppressed fury, profound humiliation, and dawning panic, was forced into the ignominious position of convening an emergency HOA board meeting. It was a chaotic affair, conducted through a bewildering series of increasingly agitated phone calls, terse emails, and glitchy video conferences. The arguments, Hank later heard whispered through the valley grapevine, were volcanic. Accusations and recriminations flew like poisoned darts. Voices were raised, threats were made. Some board members, who had long harbored private reservations about Martha's autocratic leadership and her increasingly dismissive handling of the river situation, now sensed a pivotal moment, a chance to temper her unchecked power, using the escalating crisis, the very public, very smelly symbol of her misjudgment, as undeniable leverage. The undeniable, stinking reality of a multi-million-dollar koi collection rapidly decomposing in a man-made mud pit. The increasingly pervasive stench now wafting inexorably towards their exclusive million-dollar homes, and the looming, terrifying threat of health department intervention, EPA fines, and a public relations catastrophe of epic proportions proved to be a remarkably potent motivator. Even the thickest-skinned among them could see the writing on the wall. By late afternoon, as the shadows began to lengthen and the air grew cool, a visibly chastened and exhausted HOA lawyer, a man named Henderson whose tailored suit now looked rumpled and whose face bore the gray pallor of extreme stress, arrived once more at Hank's farm. He drove a modest sedan this time, not Martha's ostentatious SUV. He carried a leather briefcase containing a meticulously drafted document and a formal, signed letter from the editor-in-chief of the Clear Creek County Chronicle. The letter confirmed, in no uncertain terms, the prominent placement of the HOA statement on the front page of the next day's edition. Hank, seated on his porch swing, took his time. He read the apology with the same careful deliberation he would use when inspecting a complex piece of machinery or a prize bull. It was, as expected, couched in carefully chosen legalese, designed to minimize direct admission of personal fault for Martha. Yet the core concessions, the ones he had demanded, were undeniably there. The Sterling Springs Homeowners Association hereby acknowledges the significant historical and cultural importance of the agricultural structures previously located on Mr. Hank Rivers' ancestral property. And further, the association expresses its profound regret for the distress and irretrievable loss occasioned by their removal, an action undertaken without sufficient prior consultation and due respectful consideration for the deep-rooted heritage and contributions of long-standing members of our wider valley community. It concluded with a somewhat hollow-sounding commitment to actively foster improved communication, mutual understanding, and profound respect for all residents, present and future. It was signed, Martha Collins, President, her usually flamboyant signature looking somewhat cramped and subdued. Hank nodded slowly. Once, the words, while carefully sanitized, represented a crack in the fortress of arrogance. He then looked the lawyer squarely in the eye. This needs to be notarized, your client's signature, and I'll be present. Henderson paled slightly. Mrs. Collins is indisposed at the moment. She has authorized me, via a legally executed power of attorney, to oversee the notarization of her signature on her behalf. Hank considered this. All right, we'll go into town, to Sarah Beth Compton at the Mercantile. She's been the notary here for 40 years. She'll do. He wanted no question, no loophole, no future claim of coercion or misunderstanding. The drive to the small town of Clear Creek was a quiet, tense affair. Hank drove his old pickup, Henderson following meekly in his sedan. Sarah Beth, a woman whose sharp eyes missed little, notarized the document with a raised eyebrow at the content but made no comment beyond the professional necessities. With the notarized apology, its ink still drying, and the newspaper's unequivocal confirmation clutched firmly in his calloused hand, Hank drove back to his farm. The lawyer, having fulfilled his unpleasant duty, trailed him like a reluctant, chastised shadow, eager to be dismissed. As the sun, a great ball of molten orange, began to dip below the western peaks for the second time since the great valve had been closed, casting impossibly long, dramatic shadows across the now expectant valley, Hank Rivers, a solitary figure of quiet resolve, walked back into the cool, damp interior of his pump house. The lawyer remained outside, pacing nervously, kicking at loose stones in the driveway. Down at Sterling Springs, a small, anxious crowd had gathered near the rapidly deteriorating pond, Tanaka, his face a mask of exhaustion and despair. A few remaining loyal resort staff, their uniforms stained with mud and sweat, and even a pale, drawn Martha Collins. She had emerged from her self-imposed seclusion in her palatial home, drawn by the faintest, most desperate flicker of hope, a last chance to salvage something from the wreckage of her ambition. Her eyes were fixed on the distant rise of Hank's land. With the same deliberate, unhurried strength he had used to close it nearly 48 agonizing hours before, Hank laid his hands upon the great cast-iron wheel. The groan of the valve as it began to turn was subtly different this time. Less a screech of protest, more a reluctant, weary yielding, slowly, steadily, with measured turns. He opened it, not just to its previous flow, but a fraction wider, sending a surge of clear, cool, life-giving mountain water surging down the well-worn creek bed. It took what felt like an eternity for the increased volume to navigate the twists and turns of the creek, to reach the parched intake pipes of Sterling Springs, to flush through their sophisticated but now overwhelmed filtration systems. The silence from the valley below was heavy, pregnant with a mixture of dread and fragile hope. Then a sound, faint at first, then growing stronger. A cry not of despair this time, but of disbelief, then exultation. First a hesitant trickle, then a stronger stream, then a blessed, powerful gush of fresh, untainted water began to pour into the ravaged, stinking basin of the pond. It churned the thick, foul mud, turning it into a swirling brown soup. But it also brought oxygen. It brought movement. It brought life. The few remaining koi, those that had miraculously clung to a sliver of existence in the deoxygenated sludge, began to stir, their dulled colors faintly visible as they instinctively moved towards the life-giving inflow. Tanaka and his depleted team, galvanized by the sudden reprieve, worked with renewed, almost superhuman energy through the night and into the next day. They managed the delicate refilling process, treated the severely shocked and traumatized fish, and began the grim task of removing the hundreds of dead. The losses were catastrophic. Many of the most prized, iconic specimens, the grand champion Kohaku, the ancient, revered Asagi, the flawless Sankei that had been Martha's particular pride, were gone forever. The pond, even when eventually restored, would never be quite what it was. A deep, indelible scar would remain, a watery monument to hubris and its consequences. Martha Collins stood by the edge of the slowly reviving pond, her expensive shoes sinking slightly into the muddy bank, her expression unreadable in the harsh glare of the emergency floodlights. The financial cost to the HOA would be immense, running into the hundreds of thousands, perhaps more, when accounting for fish replacement, pond remediation, and potential lawsuits from disgruntled residents. Her authority, once absolute, had been irrevocably fractured. Several board members were already muttering about a vote of no confidence. She had profoundly underestimated Hank Rivers, dismissed him as an insignificant, uncultured relic of a bygone era. She had learned, in the most public and humiliating way possible, that dignity and respect were not commodities to be casually bought, sold, or bulldozed into oblivion. The next morning, the Clear Creek County Chronicle landed with a soft thud on porches and in mailboxes throughout the valley. The headline, stark and uncompromising, above the full text of the HOA statement. Read, HOA issues public apology to local rancher after devastating koi pond crisis. Hank read it on his porch, a steaming mug of black coffee in his hand. He didn't smile. He simply folded the paper neatly and set it aside. Justice, like a well-tended crop, had its own season. Later that week, a modest, newly painted sign appeared at the foot of Hank's long driveway. Just below his old, weathered Rivers Ranch sign, it read, in simple, clear lettering, established 1903, we believe in respecting our neighbors. We expect the same in return. Life in the valley didn't magically transform overnight. The tensions between the old ways and the new ambitions didn't simply evaporate, but something fundamental had shifted, a subtle rebalancing of the scales. The brash, new money of the Sterling Springs had been served a very public, very humbling lesson by the quiet, steadfast resolve of the valley's old roots. Hank Rivers continued to work his land, his quiet, unwavering strength a silent, living testament to the enduring power of standing your ground for what is right. He never rebuilt the barn in exactly the same spot. The cleared, leveled space remained, a poignant reminder not only of what had been so carelessly lost, but also of what had been so hard won. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his grandfather, and his father before him, would have understood and approved. Sometimes, the price of pride was indeed steep, a lesson Martha Collins would carry with her for the rest of her days. Every time she gazed upon her, now significantly less grand, forever marked koi pond, with its noticeably diminished stock and the lingering phantom smell of mud and decay, she would be forced to remember the quiet, determined farmer who had taught her, in all of Sterling Springs, that while water could be diverted, dignity could not, and its lack, once exposed, was a cost no amount of money could ever truly redeem.